Hezké odpoledne.
Good
Moje
afternoon.
jméno je Josef Patočka.
My name is Josef Patočka. I work
Výzkumník a
as a researcher
kampaněr v Resetu, platformě pro sociálně ekologickou
and a
transformaci.
campaign manager at the Reset platform for socio-economic transformation. It's a Czech organization that tries to support the transformation towards social, ecological, and democratic economy. And within the framework of our efforts, we are also a part of the work group for degrowth or non-growth with the Czech Climate Coalition. That may be why my task today is to host a discussion with our guest, and our guest is Giorgos Kallis, whom I will introduce shortly.
So now I will switch to English to welcome Giorgos Kallis with us, if only through the internet. And Giorgos Kallis is one of the foremost ecological economists in the world today, I would say, a professor of political ecology at the Institute of Environmental Sciences and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Catalonia, Spanish state. This Institute of Environmental Sciences and Technology in Barcelona is known in the scientific or social scientific world as one of the major academic institutions, research centers, connected to the idea, the research program, and the you could say proposal also a political economic paradigm of degrowth, which is this idea of the need to selectively downscale, shrink the economy in the rich world to be able to achieve global ecological and social justice and restore the balance with the natural world, because growth is unsustainable. And that's why the debate probably is called 50 years later. This year is the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth report of the Club of Rome, which has started the debate of limits, about limits to growth in the 70s. We have been growing since then for 50 years, and the debate now, in the face of the escalating and multiple interconnected crises, economic crises, ecological crisis, not just the climate crisis, but the broader ecological crisis. So this is a debate that Giorgos has been intervening in with his scientific work and his writing for some time now, producing works such as Degrowth, a vocabulary for a new era, together with other researchers, in defense of degrowth, which is a book that has recently been published in Czech, and we have it here, and there will be the possibility to buy it after the debate. Or Limits, Why Malthus Was Wrong and Environmentalists Should Care, where Giorgos is proposing that limits are something that we should actually approach positively as something that we have to set ourselves individually and collectively to be free, which is one of the ideas that we will have the space to explore here. But first, there is the time for Giorgos' opening speech or the keynote speech to introduce what degrowth is about, and for that I will pass the word to him now.
Thank you, Joseph. I understand I have 20 minutes for my first intervention, right? And then will be the interview, no? I'm very happy to be with you. I can't see you very well. I see the back of your heads as shades, so I don't know who you are or how many you are. But it's pleasant to imagine that I am in a documentary film festival in Prague, so I can fantasize about being there and what would it be like. Unfortunately, I couldn't travel, but I'm really happy for the opportunity and for the invitation, and also for engaging with an audience that it's not, let's say, the standard academic audience or sometimes activist audience that I normally address. So in that sense, I hope that my ideas can inspire you or inspire some thought at that time, at that, let's say, less graceful time, which is immediately after lunch, and it's the time where sugar goes down in our brains. No? I'm gonna intervene. I'm gonna explain two things that Josef already mentioned. The first, and they both go around the idea of limits and the idea of how we come to think about limits and how we come to think about limits to growth. The first thing that I want to talk to is where do we stand as scientists and as societies, but what does science tell us of where do we stand as societies in relation to this prediction that was made 50 years ago in a report written by a group of young scientists at the MIT in Boston, where they wrote this report called the Limits to Growth, that for some, according to some, it's the foundational document of modern Western environmentalism. And it was a scientific report using models and computers that at that time, you know, a computer was not a laptop where you could talk at Zoom, you know, it was like a huge monster that was occupying a whole room, and then you would just use it to make calculations you couldn't do with your hand. So not very difficult calculations, let's say, that now we do at Excel. But at the time you needed these huge computers, and they used these first computers at MIT to do the first models that were looking at what would happen to the world as a whole if industrial production, global industrial production, kept growing at the same pace that it had grown from the 1900s to 1970s. So they said, like, okay, let's see what we know. Let's see what relations we know exist between population, resources, pollution, industrial production, and then let's see where this leads. And famously, this report predicted a sort of collapse that would happen, would start unfolding anytime between the 2020s in the business as usual scenario, that everything went as it was going up to then and nothing much changed, to around 2050 to 2100 in some scenarios that they were more optimistic about the development of new technologies. So why was the collapse coming in these scenarios? The mathematics were complex, but more or less the dynamic that was playing out was like, if the economy grows at a compound rate of 2 or 3%, this means at 3%, it means it doubles every 20 years. It's four times bigger in 40 years. It's 8 times bigger in 60 years, etc., etc. So an economy that grows at 3% every year doubles, and then it's 4 times 8, 16 times bigger every 23 years, more or less, if it grows at 3%. Given this dynamic, they found that resources cannot grow that fast. The resources are more or less fixed. Maybe we can find more resources that we knew before, but at some point they will start getting harder and harder to extract them. Or if not resources, and we have good technologies to manage the resources, they found that the pollution that we will create in the atmosphere, and at the time they didn't really know about climate change. They just mentioned it, that heating of the planet could be a problem, but they didn't really know about that. It was like a very ahead of its time, let's say, prediction. They said if not resources, then pollution might catch up with us, and at some point, population that would also grow at that pace as long as there is no resource or pollution problem. At some point, it will collapse, and this will be a sudden collapse. Why would it be a sudden collapse? They used a nice metaphor, which is, imagine a huge lake and a small algae that is very small, but it doubles every, let's say, then it was 20 years if we talk about economic growth, but you can say every 1 or 2 years the algae grows, doubles. So like this, the algae is small at the beginning and it's like nothing compared to the lake. Then it's 2 times bigger, then it's 4 times bigger, then it's 8 times bigger. Suddenly, the last period of time where the algae is going to occupy the whole lake is just going to be half of it, because the last doubling is going to be from half to occupying the whole lake. So what they showed was that the power of compound growth, of these continuous doublings of the economy, means that at the end the doublings are going to be that big that the last period where we're going to experience collapse, where the economy is going to be so big that one more doubling will completely collapse the resources or cause pollution, is going to be a comparatively small period of time. How does this bore in terms of data? Because we are 50 years after. Were they correct in what they predicted or not? And what I'm saying here is based on an article I wrote with a team of 7 or 8, we are 8 in total, more scientists, ecological economists, and that we are planning to publish this year on the occasion of the 50 years from the limits to growth, where we are revisiting the data and we are looking at where do we stand in relationship to that prediction. And what we find is that more or less we are in line with a model that predicted, that was, let's say, optimistic in terms of our capacity to find more resources for a while, technological capacity, but where collapse comes because of pollution, which more or less fits the picture that we have right now, that the economy is on a very dire situation, given the impacts on the climate. And the impacts from climate are going to kick back to the economy and kick back to societies, leading to undesirable consequences. So our scientific analysis finds that more or less we are in this path, and that this path spells serious trouble starting now and at the best case scenario within the next 20, 30 years. And that's not very different from what you might have heard from the IPCC. If you saw the news yesterday, the IPCC is the institution of scientists at the UN level that produces the best and most consensual knowledge around climate change. And they said, like, we are doing really bad, we are not going to meet the target that was set by governments in Paris, which was to keep the change of temperature within 1.5 degrees Celsius. That it's not good, it's what we are already living, but at least it's not likely to be as catastrophic as it will be hitting the planet more than 1.5. So what they are saying is that we are really bound to cross 1.5 degrees Celsius, and actually very soon, the way governments are going and the way the economies are going. So that's one part of what I want to talk about, limits to growth and the prospect of this economic growth to lead to a societal, very undesirable consequences. I don't know if this inspires you, probably doesn't inspire you, probably depresses you. That's what some students in our master's program tell me. I came here to take inspiration, but I live the master and now I have anxiety or depression. I hope that's not the case, because my understanding of humanity is that we've always lived through very difficult periods, and that period is likely to be perhaps more difficult than anything in the past, but not necessarily in relative terms more difficult than what people lived in other dark periods of humanity. And it is in these periods that humans come together, they organize, they challenge the powers that create the disasters, and it's also the moments where humanity's history changes. It's through these difficult moments. So if I can inspire you a little bit, I would say that we are not doomed, and we are not doomed because we are humans, and we know that we humans know how to come together in difficult situations and solve problems, and also throw away those who cause these problems. In this particular case, I would say those who cause the problems are the 1% of capitalist elites who hold economic and political power in their hands, and they want the system to keep moving the way it's moving so that this power doesn't slip away from their hands. The second part of what Josef talked about and what I want to talk today in the remaining 9 minutes is how to think about limits, and that's based on my book Limits, which is not a scientific book, it's more a philosophical book, it's more an intellectual book, it's more a humanities book of personal stories and has a lot of cinema in it. So if anyone wants to translate it in Czech, I would be very happy to bring you into contact with my publishers at Stanford. We've already published it in Japanese, in Greek, Spanish and Catalan, obviously, and French. So there is some interest for people to read the book in different languages. And the book makes a very specific argument, or two arguments, let's say. The first argument is that under capitalism, our relationship to the idea of limits is quite paradoxical, if not schizophrenic, in a sense. On the one hand, we are constantly worried about these limits, the collapse that I was warning you about right now. Like, we are saturated with images. I don't know if anyone watched this French TV series called Collapse, no? This image of the absolute limit and then of society, civilization collapsing as a result. And at the same time, there is a constant obsession and cultural saturation with the idea of overcoming limits. From going to your gym and hearing like there are no limits, you can do whatever you want, or reading a coaching book that tells the same, to the obsession of Elon Musk or Bezos to take a spacecraft and escape Earth, or to the crazy ideas of tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley that they will be able to take their brain thought and store it into chips and then have these chips live forever. All these are obsessions quite strong in humanity, especially under capitalism, of overcoming limits. And I argue in my book that we can understand the history of capitalism as a history of a system that needed to invoke limits in order to galvanize all powers to combat and overcome these limits. You can think here of the colonization of the Americas from the British. There was a lot of thinking at the time, not least by a priest who became economist called Thomas Robert Malthus, and with whom I deal in my book, that England was limited, the space of the island was very limited, population could no longer grow in the island, and then this was the whole momentum of colonizing and exterminating people in other parts of the world that they were seen as free and unoccupied. Now, the whole machine of capitalism works like that. So there is perceived to be always scarcity. So there is never enough for everyone to live a good life. There is always a limit. Like, you will never hear, you know what, this country is rich enough. Well done, you know, they don't need to be any more rich. Or you'll never hear any person saying, rich person saying, oh, you know, Elon Musk has more than enough now, so he's gonna stop trying to have more, you know, he's done pretty well, no? That's not the logic of capitalism. The logic of capitalism is that you never have enough. Why? Because there are poor people, because you could do more things. So there is always like a sense of scarcity, which is real under capitalism, because capitalism never redistributes the wealth that it produces. So even countries that they are many times more rich than they were before, still they have poor people. So like England has as many poor people as it had 50 years ago, and the economy is 3 times bigger. I guess you could say the same for most other Western countries. So in that sense, capitalism is a system that there is never enough, there is always a limit, there is always scarcity, but at the same time, this image of not having enough is galvanized for overcoming this limit. So it's a justification of why the system needs more and more economic growth, and why this economic growth is never supposed to be enough, and it's never supposed to stop. So like, okay, we've grown enough. There is never enough under capitalism. That's the main argument I make in the book. And to that, I juxtapose ideas that one can find in their local intellectual histories or traditions or spiritualities. I trace it on my own roots or on the roots on which I've been educated, and that's classical Greece and the Athenian democracy of classical times, where there are very strong ideas of a good life being a life lived within limits, and that a life without limits is a life in which you cannot be free, because only if you know your limits and you know your desires and you know how to satisfy them, you are a free person. If you're a person who doesn't know what he or she wants, then you're a person lost in this life where nothing will ever satisfy you. This was a basic wisdom in classical Greece. There were tragedies around that. There were common says. There were stories people were telling about themselves. There were the way they were exercising. There was what the philosophers were writing about. But it's not only Greece. You take Buddhism. Some of you might do meditation to relax from the stressful life of producing documentary films. You will know too all this wisdom, no? So it's not a property of Greece. It's property of all societies. And all societies have this common sense of a good life being a life that is sufficient and that knows what it is asking for. It is this notion of limits as a spiritual value and most of all political project, because you cannot just limit yourself. You need to have a society that allows you to limit yourself, that I reclaim in this book, and that I link to what we call the degrowth movement. I argue that the degrowth movement, with all its proposals for policies, economic policies, social policies, environmental policies, in order to stop this catastrophic unfolding of the economy towards endless economic growth, this movement, I argue, is a movement. It's a part of the ecological movement and the social justice movement, that what it does is it revives this wisdom that has traveled through time, through different spiritual movements and social movements, from the Romantics to anarcho-feminists in the beginning of the 20th century, to the environmental movement in its most radical edges. Many different waves of thought and waves of, if you want, also intellectual thought and artistic expression that have challenged this fake dream of capitalism, of unlimited desires that require an endless expansion in order to be satisfied, but never really satisfied because they are infinite and they will never be satisfied. Now, to finish, in my book, and without realizing it, I got a little bit into culture and art and how do we think about limits, which I didn't do it explicitly, but somehow it came up, you know, and now retrospectively I realized there was a lot of it in it. There was a lot of it in it, why? Because the main metaphor I use in the book to explain my notion of limits comes from a movie, The Legend of 1900, is a Giuseppe Tornatore movie, based on a theater play from a writer from Naples. It's basically the story of a person who is born and lives all his life in a boat that travels, you know, it's the 1900s, and it travels from Europe to the US, does this trip. And this guy stays always there and refuses to go out, you know. So I'm not gonna spoil the movie for you. In most of my presentations, I spoil movies. So I say exactly what happens to the end to make my thesis. I'm not gonna do it today because some of you might be filmmakers and will say, who is this idiot academic who spoils movies? I don't want him again in any presentation. He might spoil my own movie. I'm not gonna spoil anything, but watch the movie in the 1900s, because it is a play, a theater play, and a plot that captures this notion of limits with all its contradictions and all its problems. And in my book, I contradict that. I contradict also the form and the plots, but also the form of ancient Greek tragedies, which I argue they were also stories of limits and of self-limitation. I contradict that to the Hollywood plot, which on the contrary is the capitalist It's a capitalist dream symbolized in the plot, where there is always a hero who in the first 1/3 of the movie encounters a limit, an enemy, some challenge, and then the rest of the movie is spent with the hero fighting the limit, and then the happy end, which is normally the case for Hollywood movies, is the hero beating the limit, overcoming the limit. And arguing that in different presentations, at some point, I saw also the connection, you know, like the Hollywood, where is Hollywood? Is the far west. Where is the far west? Is the end point of British colonization, Anglo colonization of the Americas. It is the point where the capitalist dream reached in its extreme, and it is the place where the justification of this capitalist dream is reproduced to our days. Is this dream of limitless growth, which will not have a happy end, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgos. I will now ask a few questions that I have been thinking of in the weeks before this debate. And maybe let's start with sticking to the idea of freedom and this problematic of freedom and of limits and self-limitation or outside limitation, in the sense that it's also that freedom is invoked as a defense of the growth economy and of the system. And we have seen this recently also in the Czech public sphere, in the West and in the Anglophone world. The idea of degrowth is provoking a lot of backlash, a lot of anger, a lot of shitstorms. Sometimes it's pretty emotional, harsh, and probably it's showing that the idea of degrowth is definitely like touching a nerve in the collective psyche of our civilization, and we also had this this year. It's like a year of degrowth becoming a major topic of debate also in the Czech. In some parts, at least, of the Czech public debate. We had the first degrowth conference in Brno, and so on. And recently, there has been probably the first opinion piece published in the Czech media, which basically is a harsh criticism of the idea of degrowth. And the argument is completely taken, it's just copied from a book that came out recently. It's from an economist from Harvard University, which I think is typical. His name is Alessio Terzi, and he wrote this book recently called Growth for Good, and it's this vigorous defense of the idea of economic growth, and basically the arguments that Ondřej Houska, this journalist from Hospodářské noviny, from the Economics Daily, the argument is twofold. There are two arguments. One of them is that actually we need growth to stop the climate crisis. The title of the opinion piece literally is growth, growth, growth. Growth has to be 3 times in the title so that you don't miss it. Growth, growth, growth. It's the only thing that can stop global warming, and anyone who says otherwise wants to take away our freedom. And so the argument is twofold. One is that we need growth because growth is what fosters innovation, new technology that can displace the bad technology. And if that's not convincing enough, It's also that a non-growing economy would necessarily be unfree, because in the capitalist economy, you have freedom of choice in the marketplace. You can choose whatever, it's your choice. You are free to choose. In a degrowth economy, in a non-growing economy, it couldn't be that way. He uses an example of in a growth economy, if your grandma is sick, you can take a car and drive her to the hospital. For some reason, he doesn't think of a public ambulance. I don't know why, but that's the argument. Whereas in an eco-socialist degrowth economy, everybody would have to make all the decisions together, or they would have to be done by a bureaucratic top-down authority. So my question is, what your responses to such arguments would be? How is it with would degrowth end innovation, and would a degrowth society necessarily be unfree? Because when you say that someone wants to take away your freedom, you know, it's this way of like, yeah, they have to be evil if they want to take away other people's freedom, right? But I don't believe Giorgos to be evil, so.
I think I'm not evil, but who knows what is evil and what is good, you know, of course. I don't think any person is evil, you know. I think people are contradictory in general saying, and even the ones I most disagree, I don't think, maybe there are, I don't know, a couple of evil people, but first of all, about ecological conditions, I don't know what this journalist knows, or the author. The author works for the European Commission, actually, not for Harvard, but the book was published by Harvard. He's also not an environmental scientist. I don't know what they know. I know what I know. I know what I study. I know what I publish. I know the models we do with my students. And if they know something better, I would like to see it. I mean, the mathematics are not very difficult. Something that turns to infinity is not sustainable. And when we go to the specifics in terms of carbon emissions, like an economy that is going to be 10 times bigger by the end of this century, is very, very unlikely to not be an economy that hasn't destroyed the climate. Even in the most science fiction scenarios that doesn't destroy the climate, it will destroy other things in order to save the climate. And that's the story of economic growth up to now. It's, I mean, economists are people who are trying to defend the system at all costs. You know, they're like kind of like the priests were in the feudal era. Now you have the economists, you know, and they're going to tell you, no, everything is fine. Don't worry, capitalism is working fine. They can make very clever arguments to tell you why growth can keep taking place even without using resources. But anyone who is a normal person, and of course anyone who is a natural scientist even more, they understand that you cannot have production without using resources, and that more and more production would mean more and more resources, more and more transformation, more and more buildings, more and more sand coming out of the earth, more and more minerals, more and more waste. I mean, it's really obvious, but then of course you have very clever people that they study most of their life in Harvard to disprove the obvious, you know, and they're very clever. And then there are of course people who share their ideology and they are happy to reproduce these clever arguments. Now they're clever, but they are wrong. I'm sorry, that's the problem. And I don't think this makes me good or evil. No, it's just like a matter of fact and a matter of reality. Now about freedom. Freedom is a big word, and it's normally used by those who are in a powerful, the way you put it. It's used by those who, because freedom is a great ideal. No, it was the ideal of the French Revolution, you know. But the French Revolution was against those who were holding the power and were screwing all the rest. And it was like, we want to be free, you know. We want to live our lives in full potential, and we want to create a society here that we all live a good life, and it's like enough with you keeping us in our chains. And that was freedom. Now freedom in our times, and since Ronald Reagan and many others, has taken this peculiar idea of freedom, which is like, it's the freedom of those who already have a lot of power and more or less can do whatever they like, to keep doing it. You know, it's like, no, I'm gonna do whatever I like, no matter what what I cost to you or anyone else. That's not the idea of freedom that has any relationship to anything written in political theory or in any spiritual teaching, you know. It's a very perverse idea of freedom. So it's the idea, you know what, I'm gonna use my car no matter what. Am I going to make it impossible for you to use your bike? Fine, I'm gonna use my car because I like to use my car. Am I going to destroy the climate and your kid is gonna live like a climate refugee 50 years from now because I want to emit petroleum now to drive my grandmother around to the shopping mall? I'm gonna keep doing it, you know? And what happens to you, I don't care because I have the power to keep doing it and it's my freedom to keep doing it. So that's the dominant idea of freedom defended. Because if we think in more complicated terms, your freedom to use the car encroaches on my freedom to use my bike. The question is not, let's all be free. The question is like, who is going to do what is necessary to do? And my argument is that my freedom to use the bike comes before your freedom to use your car, because my bike is not putting your life in danger. If I fall with my bike in your car, I'm not gonna kill you. Plus, my bike is not emitting carbon, so it's not making anyone risk their life in the future. So in that sense, it is a freedom, but it's a freedom, what we are arguing, of doing things differently. So I really do feel that those who advocate the growth are not free right now. As many other people in this society, they are not free. The people who produce our cell phones and they extract under dire conditions minerals in Africa, or they work for pittance in factories in Bangladesh, are they free? No, they're not free. So we're talking about their freedom, and their freedom, not to talk about the people already suffering the climate impacts, and we're going to multiply in the future. So we're talking about their freedom, and their freedom requires a change of the current production and consumption model. This is in order to make people live freer and more dignified lives in the future. And that's the argument in my book, that limiting growth and limiting also unlimited desires that they are catastrophic is the only way to maintain a certain level of freedom. It's also, if you want, in a more philosophical way, and this is where I use the metaphor of the movie, The Legend of 1900, is only when you have like a limit within which you can create, that you can freely express also your creativity and your desires. Like, think of a piano, it's a limited keyboard, it's not infinite. A canvas to paint is limited, you know? You need these limits in order to create. When they give you this ridiculous choice of 1 million products to do the same thing, you know, in a supermarket, is this freedom? No, I would argue that's like taking away my freedom. I just want two things and let me choose between two, you know? I don't want 1 million. That's my freedom, to be able to live a life that is dignified, that is creative, and that has meaning. Now, also to dispel a little bit this myth that economic growth brings freedom, let us say that we see that Western societies are getting less and less, let's say, liberal in the standard sense of the term, you know, in the sense that inspired you in the Czech Republic. They're getting less and less free in that sense, and that often is justified in the name of growth. And also, if we think of the society that right now is economy that it's experiencing the higher growth, that is China. And you explained to me how China is a free society or is getting freer as time passes. So this myth that economic growth brings freedom, or that economic growth takes place in order to bring freedom, is maybe a myth that would make sense to someone 40 years ago, but not today. Which Western country is getting more free? You know, which country? I mean, all the countries are just saying like, you will not be able to do this and that. You're gonna continue living in poverty. We're gonna cut all the social support we were giving you. You're not gonna have a public hospital to drive your grandmother. You know, you're gonna have to die or be super rich in order to pay her. Why? Because we need the economy to keep growing and capitalists to keep being happy that they make more and more profits. So that nothing has nothing to do with freedom.
Thank you. I think also it's, and this is this is related to the problematic of limitation and self-limitation, that quite often it's the necessity to do something about the environmental crisis is framed as it is necessary to use less. So are people willing to limit themselves? This is like this is a literal phrasing how it's often framed, and then it's very easy to make the argument like if we stopped growing, if we had a degrowth or post-growth economy, it would be a form of limitation, and also it would make us poorer. You know, it's and then quite often the discourse of environmentalists sounds like, yeah, we need to limit ourselves, we need to limit our desires and expectations, we need to use less, we basically need to make ourselves poorer for the future generations. But quite often the argument of the proponents of degrowth is really the opposite, you know, saying, no, really, like from the perspective, for example, of abundance of time, you know, people being overworked and actually working more than 50 years ago in most Western societies, or in other terms, that it's not just that the transition to there is, besides the argument that the transition to a post-growth economy is necessary from a biophysical sense, there is also the argument that it is desirable in the social and psychological sense, that it's something that we should want because it would actually make us better off in many aspects. So I wanted to ask you to explain what is behind this argument, really, and maybe it's also an opportunity, because quite often the discussion gets very abstract, to take a little bit of a look beneath the concepts at like how would the life in a degrowth economy, what would the life in a degrowth economy look like? Like how could it look like, and why we might desire it or why we might actually like living in a degrowth economy better than living in this one?
So let's compare a bicycle to a car. Okay. A bicycle uses less materials to be produced, emits less carbon, travels slower, and does what it does. So that's less. Is this less a sacrifice? Not necessarily. I mean, it depends. Staying stuck in traffic the whole day, being able to go in the city and move around with your bike, that doesn't seem to me a sacrifice if a city becomes hospitable to bikes. Is this a retrogression? Is it something that sacrifice that we have less? No. I mean, you might argue there are people of lesser abilities. There is the old grandma that needs to go to the hospital. We didn't say ban all the cars, you know, or get them there on bicycles on the back of your bicycle, you know. But you can have like the extra things for the extra needs you might have, but the normal form of mobility, not the only one, I insist, but the normal one right now is the car, could become the bike and the train. This would lead to less resource use, less pollution, less. Is this less a sacrifice? No. Is this less bad? No. Consider another example, you know, like average family in the US, I don't know how many times they eat meat per week, or in Europe, what sort of meat they are eating, from where it's coming, what quality it is, in what form they are eating it, etc., or synthetic food, etc., that uses chemicals, it's processed, it needs factories in order to be processed, etc. Let's say we manage to transition to a more balanced diet, that it's based on locally sourced food, that it's on a closer distance, that it's closer to the way we were eating some decades ago, and we were healthier in most societies, that it uses meat products on special occasions, on the Sunday, on the day that, I don't know, you celebrate something, etc. And on the other days is a varied data based on on a variety of vegetables and other source of proteins, etc. I'm not saying everyone become vegan, okay? Like you have the freedom to, we have the freedom to become vegans, and there is also the possibility of transitioning to a much more balanced and locally sourced diet. Again, this would reduce carbon emissions, we know that from science. This would reduce land use, would reduce resource use. At the same time, it would make us healthier. I mean, people are paying money and money to get diets to just hear that they have to get the Mediterranean diet, which is how my grandmother was eating, you know, without knowing that she was eating the Mediterranean diet. And she was like a thin, beautiful lady. I almost said healthy, but she wasn't healthy because she was smoking a lot, which wasn't fun. Anyway, she get many diseases, but because of smoking, you know, it was another industrial encroachment in her life. But so again, is this less something that it's worse? Now, let's say that we produce less in general, and that means we're gonna work also less. So we're gonna stop producing in a degrowth society things that they are not necessary in the sense that they are not satisfying some basic material need that we have in terms of clothing, in terms of heating, in terms of living a decent life. So a lot of production, we might argue, is unnecessary in the context of climate change, and we stop this production, and models show that this would mean we would have to work less. Okay, we would have to work less in our office and go to our factory, wherever we happen to work, and then we're gonna have more time to be with our friends, make love, make jokes, joke with our friends, have fun, and walk around and marvel in our city, etc. You know, at a more relaxed pace than the one we have right now, that we are working 8 hours per day, and then we are also 3 hours per day for checking our WhatsApp and Telegram. Is this less again going to be worse? Is it going to be a sacrifice? No, it's not going to be a sacrifice. At least for me, it's not a sacrifice. It's going to be much nicer. You're going to tell me, okay, if it's so nicer, why don't you do it already? And this is where it's important to think of a transition as a structural transition, as a societal transition, as an organizational transition, because yes, if you live in London and you take your bike and you go out, it's at your own risk, you know, like so many cyclists are killed every week because like trucks can still go in the center of the city and they crash on bicyclists. If I want to have a more healthy and balanced diet, yes, I have to pay a lot and go to specialized organic stores that they sell things more expensive, etc., you know. If I want to work less, I'm gonna get less salary, and probably the way society, and I don't want to check my Telegram and WhatsApp every minute, I'm gonna fall behind in my current job that is structured around these things. So this is why we're saying it's a personal and a structural change. And it's a personal and a structural change towards a more developed, if you want, a more advanced future where we finally enjoy the fruits of what we have been producing and what we are able to do, rather than keep being poor and keep running faster and faster in order to produce more and more, to remain as poor and get poorer than before, and also see our freedoms being taken away.
In the in the current economic crisis, the trends towards larger and larger economic inequality is deepening, also in Czech Republic. Like more and more people it's harder and harder for them to pay their electricity bills and rents, while basically everyone in the 100 richest Czechs have got richer during the COVID pandemic, energy crisis, and then the crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so it's really hard to imagine this kind of transition and this cutting of production and freeing people to have much more free time and so on. It's also like people a lot of people don't want to have to work less in today's society, right? Because if you talk to them, because for them it's like they need the money to pay for the commodified life necessities. And what I'm getting at, it's hard to imagine it without a major redistribution of wealth, incomes, property. And in this sense, like, degrowth is aligned or inspired or is also like connected to the other traditions of critique of capitalism and proposals to transform it in the past. Mostly, I would say, traditions of libertarian and democratic socialism, social democracy, or anarchism, or socialism in general. And I would say that you are one of the people in the post-growth debate who are most open about this. You have also co-authored a manifesto called For an Eco-Socialist Degrowth, literally. And this, like, this raises an issue in the Czech debate because in Czechoslovakia, as in other countries of the former Soviet bloc, we obviously have a trauma from the state socialist dictatorship, from authoritarian socialism, and that's some kind of experience that in many ways we share with Greeks. Actually, I was when doing my research on the debate, I was surprised to learn, if I'm not mistaken, that your mother has been imprisoned for opposing a dictatorship in Greece, which was not a socialist dictatorship; it was a standard capitalist dictatorship. But so what I'm getting at is, like, what do you mean by this socialism that you talk about, or how to approach this trauma of trying to transform or overcome capitalism and ending in a dictatorship in which actually the also often then there is this argument, like, so you're criticizing capitalism because it's destroying the planet, but the Soviet model was no better at this. Like, in many senses, it was similarly or even more destructive of the environment. And I believe this is a topic that needs addressing. So that's a question I wanted to pose to you. When you talk of socialism, what kind of socialism do you mean? And how would it guarantee people's freedom and basic liberties?
Yeah, there are many questions there, and it's a big, huge discussion. But like, to repeat what you said, so you said that people would have to work less. Under the current system, there is 100 rich people that they get richer and richer, and then the rest have to work more and more in order to keep up. So forget socialism, forget capitalism, forget using any of these big terms that are historically loaded. So your very logic was like, okay, if these people have to work less in order to be okay in the planet, and also because it's fair, you know, and they maintain the same salary, which is not a crazy idea, you know, like Roosevelt in the US in the 1930s, who by today's standards would be considered an extreme socialist. He was the president of the US. When there was the Great Depression, he cut the hours people worked. They were working 45 hours per week. He cut them to 35, and he kept the same salary. He didn't reduce their salary. And of course, this, I don't think it's something that many people would not like, apart from a few workaholics that they really like what they're doing, no? But this is the idea, like, okay, there is a crisis. We need to work less, and we redistribute from those that have made, and they have unnecessarily much. So, you know, you say they would have to redistribute property, and it sounds like you're going to take the house of someone, you know, and that, I mean, that's misleading, because it sounds like, okay, it's going to happen what happened in the Soviet era, that you would take the house of someone and divide it in three, and then three families would enter inside. You know, that's not the idea. Right now you have corporations. In Berlin, for example, 10% of all the houses are owned by corporations that they own more than 3,000 apartments in the city each, you know. That's a crazy amount of, and then people in Berlin cannot afford to pay rent to stay in the city, and they have to move out and then commute 2 or 3 hours every day to go to the center of the city to work. This is grotesquely unequal, you know, so that these people can have 3,000 apartments and keep making money in the stock exchange. Like the majority of Berliners have to travel 2 or 3 hours per day and live miserable lives. You don't need to call it socialism to say that, okay, these people cannot have 3,000 houses, and this was a referendum that the people in Berlin did, you know, and we're going to take that from them. So whoever has more than 3,000 houses, which sounds to me quite a lot to have, no? We're going to take these extra houses and redistribute them to the city, plus have a minimum rent. To me, I don't know if you want to call this socialism. Call it whatever you want. You know, I call it human development. I think it's like what needs to be done and what is reasonable and what is just, and everyone understands it. You don't need to be in favor of socialism or not. Now, I have argued in favor of eco-socialism in the sense of pointing to a system that would put distribution first, would put the ecology first, and would also have a certain degree of government care for the economy, that it's considered anathema right now in extreme capitalist countries like the US or the UK, but not like in progressive and advanced capitalist countries that you might say are countries like the Scandinavian or perhaps Korea or Japan. Like more progressive capitalist countries already have a sense of the state as being an important and responsible actor, and I think more of that is necessary. We use the term eco-socialism for that, and the eco is very important because it distinguishes us from those who might argue that an industrial kind of socialism, which would do more or less what capitalism promises it can do now in terms of the environment, etc., but would be socialistic, that would be solving a problem. So I don't think that any type of socialism would be good in terms of environmental issues, but also in terms of generally the human predicament. It has to be a democratic socialism, a decentralized one, and one that it's ecological and it's degrowth in the sense of producing and less and redistributing more. Soviet Union was nothing like that. No, it wasn't a system that it came in a very different period of time, in a very different objectives. Soviet Union, in a way, invented economic growth. It was Khrushchev in the 1950s that said, we're going to grow the economy, we're going to double it the next decade. And then the Americans responded, etc. So it was a growth economy. I don't see the example of now. And of course, it wasn't explicitly ecological. So why would it be ecological? They were doing what the others were doing too. It was trying to grow and produce as many goods as possible. First, to have a strong army, and second, to have a satisfied people, which was also what the two blocs were doing. Now, the Soviets did it in a way that was authoritarian and undemocratic, as you correctly said, and as you correctly revolted against Czechoslovakia in '68 and then again in the 90s. So there isn't any effort to beautify any of that. Now, the Soviet story is a very particular story. It was a revolution that started from particular people in a particular period of time and within a military context. So it started as a war economy, and unfortunately, it remained to our date a war economy. Now, the question is Russia better than Soviet Union, that it's capitalist? So I'm not so sure. You might want to debate that, but I'm not so sure, you know. Was Greece better than Czechoslovakia? It was very good that you brought this example. No, we were living also in dictatorship. So my family wasn't free at all, you know. There was like a person following my mother whenever she was going out of the house, or the father, to see what newspaper they buy. Then they were keeping notes on them. And then at some point they arrested them because of the newspapers they were reading. So no, we didn't live in freedom either. I think it's like an illusion that the West lived in freedom while the East was living under oppression. We were all living under oppression because the two big blocks were having a big fight, and the rest of us, we were like the periphery to them. And in the periphery, they were just having dictatorships. It's the same thing in Latin America. Like, do you know what Argentina went through under capitalism? Probably worse than, sorry to say so, but worse than what you went through, you know. Argentina, like, there were people like killed families. I have friends, their families were abducted, killed, thrown from helicopters, you know, like blinded. Like, this was Indonesia. What happened in Indonesia, you know? Like thousands, hundreds of thousands of students and of people just executed. You've seen the documentary probably. Executed because of their political beliefs. So this was like a dire part of human history, as any period is a dire part of human history. So to refer to that part of history as saying, oh, that was socialism, and socialism is always like that, so capitalism is the best system and it can never change, seems to me like a very narrow and short-sighted way of understanding human affairs. So in conclusion, eco-socialism is not the socialism that you experienced. It's not something that we have experienced, and it's something, of course, that has its risks. If it were ever to happen, I mean, I don't know how it would happen, but there is nothing in its constitution and in the ideas of the people who write about it that it's not democratic, that it's challenging the idea of freedom or anything like that.
Thank you. We have some time now. I would be up for debating with Giorgos the whole afternoon, but now there's opportunity for you to pose your questions. I'm not sure where to do it. If you're supposed to come here, and I will lend you the microphone. No, there is a microphone there by friend in a white t-shirt. So if you want to ask some question of Giorgos, I see a hand raised in the very back.
Yep. Hello, do you hear me? Giorgos? Thank you. I'm Vincent Zbocek. There is one critics of the degrowth movement which says that the degrowth movement will never be able to overcome its name, degrowth, because it has negative connotations, and because it is, the critic says it is politically unacceptable or unacceptable. And this critics is, as I've seen, is also shared by one of the authors of the Limits to Growth of the book, Dennis Meadows, and he says, or he suggests to build a society or a movement with exactly the same methods and same goals, but to call it a society for human happiness. What's your opinion on this, and how do you cope with these critics? Thank you.
Human happiness is a little bit too cheesy, I think. I don't know if cheesy translates in Czech. It doesn't translate into Greek, so, but too sweet and like happiness. Yeah, everyone wants to be happy, but no one can be really happy, you know, like happiness is elusive. So to create a society for human happiness, no, I don't think so. But the purpose of degrowth, what is it? The purpose of degrowth is to criticize the dominant idea of our times, which is economic growth. So as a critique, I think it works, and it is necessary there. As long as people think that degrowth is not a good word, it is necessary, because it means that still the idea of growth is dominant and accepted. Once people are gonna say like, growth is crazy, and whoever politician like Liz Truss in England says that she's for growth and against anti-growth, we kick her out. So once this is the dominant idea, then degrowth is not necessary anymore, because indeed it doesn't capture what needs to be done. But as long as the dominant idea is growth, you need degrowth as a critique. What are the positive terms? I like the term conviviality. I like it because it emphasizes that a good society is a society of friendship, a society of interacting, a society of coming together and doing things and living well together. So I like conviviality. Plus, I like it because it's not historically loaded, no? Because once we talk about eco-socialism, there is, of course, for good reasons, this whole discussion about socialism. But is this socialism or that socialism? So conviviality is something that hasn't been tried, and it's nice. So it's a one I like. It's a one I like, I think.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah, I see a hand there.
Thank you. Sorry, there are new terms now about just transition or environmental transition of economy. Do you think that if performed suitably, it can change the situation, the global economic situation, or it's just, I don't know, some wishful thinking?
I think just transition is important, because just transition, in a narrow sense, what does it mean? It means a transition where you take into account the interests of workers. So you're not doing a transition just for the sake of doing a green energy transition, and then whoever loses their job or have to pay more for energy, they are thrown on the side. But you do it in a way that you make sure that the interests of people are taken into account. So I'm 100% with that. It's not, of course, what we are seeing now, even in the best case of the European Green Deal, which is this program of expanding renewable energy in Europe, etc. It's far from being just, in the sense that it's mostly market-driven, and markets are not just. They are what they are. Like whoever is fired is fired, and if you have to pay more for your electricity bill, you have to pay more. You see now that there are some incipient efforts to try to limit, just for a year or so, until we see what happens with the war, to limit how much people will pay and how much profit companies will make, and even that is difficult. So this demonstrates how far from a just transition we are, because it's much more obvious and immediate to say, like, okay, just distribution of energy costs and profits right now, because of a war. No one should make money in a war, no? I mean, they used to be called war profiteers back in the day. So how is it that now it's so difficult to say that it's not fine for Shell to make billions of profits during a war, and instead these billions should be just taken away from Shell and used so that people do not pay more for electricity? Anyways, to me, this seems like always an important objective, and I'm 100% in favor of a just transition. All I'm saying is that the just transition in an economy that it's going to be 10 times bigger by the end of the century is not going to be enough. So you need just transition and a slowing down of the economy, which means like reorganizing the economy in different ways.
Any more questions? Don't be afraid to ask.
Hi, can you hear me, Giorgos? Yes, perfect. I was going to ask about the idea of limits. I read your book and I really like the persuasive philosophical part. And yet, I think we're struggling a little bit is the policy implications of this. Like there is ideas of, okay, at least ideally, democratically be talking about limiting income, but then how do we tackle the resource use and actually capping resource use? Because as much as I've tried, I haven't found any ways of how to actually do this in the globalized economy. And a perfect example is like fast fashion, right? Like you have an economy or like a product that's really useless, and yet all these companies want to keep on growing. And yet I think in the policy realm, like I think now there has been a first paper that came out that it's even asking the question, how do we limit this on a global scale? If, for instance, us consuming less in the north could really have like a detrimental outcomes for the people in the global south. They're already being exploited, but maybe not having this sort of growth might not be the best. So how do we think about limiting these resources, and what are some of the political implications or policy implications of that? Like, how do we design it democratically, and how do we then put it in practice?
Yeah, these are hard questions you are asking, and they're good questions. How do you limit particular particular parts of the economy, but I think we can start from the super difficult but low-hanging fruit. You know, for example, we know that we need to limit how much fossil fuels we extract from the earth, and we know how to limit it, which is simply not to allow to extract it, right? This sounds very simple, but I mean, physically speaking, it's not impossible. You just have to say like, okay, we're not going to take this fossil fuels or this natural gas out of the earth, and then we're trying to manage with the rest. So in that way, it's not super difficult to imagine the policies, as you're saying, or the how to do it, but it's more difficult to imagine the political dynamics and will and power that will make it possible to do it. Then you raised an even more complicated case, though, that you take a specific sector, you know, and you say fashion. Okay, how do you regulate what's happening there in a globalized economy? You know, there is a movement of people, of activists in the fashion sector that they wrote a manifesto. I've seen already a paper, I don't know if the manifesto is out, which they call it defashion, and it's about the growth in the fashion sector. It would be interesting to see what policies they recommend. Again, one could imagine that the government, with a reasonable amount of power, we're not talking about a communist state that you've experienced. No, it doesn't have to be someone dictating how much its industry is going to produce year after year for 5 years, etc. You know, it can be like a reasonable social democratic state with a certain degree of regulatory power that has been completely given to corporate interests now, that says that I don't know, they sets the specifications for the duration of products that they produce, or sets the specifications for how often a company can produce new lines of clothes. I mean, I'm just thinking outside of my head right now because I don't know the fashion sector. You know, actually, we want someone to write a policy brief for us on the growth in the fashion sector, so we will explicitly look with these things. It sounds difficult, and it sounds like, okay, you do it in your country, and then what? H&M is going to leave, and then they're going to just produce for another country. But okay, if the EU was serious with all these directives that it makes about circular economy and this and that, and like, I don't think it's impossible to set some rules for fashion industries. So that's like a very light social democracy that I'm saying. But even this, as the redistribution we were talking about, or as taking profits away from energy companies right now, all these things are, I think, doable practically. I mean, you could see how they could happen, and they are very reasonable, but politically they seem like you're saying now something impossible now. How could you tell H&M that they won't be able to change their clothes every 2 months or whenever they like? I mean, this is the role of government. That's the role of government, to say like, we are going to put a limit on that because it's unsustainable, or because we have this and that goals in terms of carbon emissions, etc. You know, so you're gonna operate with these lines, produce t-shirts. I mean, I really appreciate t-shirts that last for 10 years. I don't know about you, you know. I found, I'm not gonna do any advertisement, but I had found like a small company in the US that was doing that. They were making these nice, good-looking t-shirts that they last 10 years. I really love them. I mean, I don't know, why would this not be the norm for everyone? There is the fake notion of freedom, no? Let anyone produce whatever t-shirts they like, and if someone likes to buy 10-year during t-shirts like you, they buy them. If I want to buy a t-shirt that lasts 3 months, it's also fine. But as I said, that's a false notion of freedom, because you who buy a t-shirt every 3 months is limiting my freedom to have like a reasonable summer in Greece, because like last summer I boiled of heat, you know, because of climate change. So how is it, whose freedom is taking precedence there? Thanks.
Is it? Okay, thanks. So maybe this is a very obvious question with an obvious answer, but degrowth would mean cutting down on production, I guess. So that would mean shutting down at least some factories. and the industrial part of the economy, which would lead to a lot of people losing their jobs. Is there a simple way, a simple plan that degrowth has to tackle this?
It's not simple, as it's not simple for any person to lose their job. But I mean, in the context, for example, of just transition, where we know that people who work, for example, in coal mines, etc., would ideally need to lose their job, is the whole discussion of what just transition means. Okay, how do you retrain these people to work in other industries? But also not how you just move them to other industries, but you also give them the capacity to use the skills that they had, not to feel like that they are completely devalued for what they know, but how do you repurpose their skills to new activities. There's this example of this Boeing factory in the US where workers, in the UK I think it was, where the workers took control in the 1970s and they started, with the knowledge they had, the machinery they had, they started producing windmills, for example. So it's like, how do you repurpose these activities to do something else that is socially useful and not destructive, and where people feel valued? Because the most important for all of us is to feel our work is valued. You're a filmmaker, you want to do something that you feel people value, you know? How would you feel as a filmmaker, as they told you, you know, your job is very bad for the climate, so you're gonna stop doing it, you know? Probably you wouldn't like it, but then if they told you, you know, now you can do something very different with your capacities and creativities as a filmmaker and everything, you know, you're gonna produce another form of art. It's super important, you know, and it's super valued. We all value it and love you for doing that. Then it's a different proposition. So one question is that of the transition and of the transition being just. The other is like less production, especially if it's less production of things that they are damaging and they are unnecessary, means we were producing something that was not necessary. So we can do without it and people can simply work less. It's not necessary to produce it, you know, we can do less. And people can work less hours. So you share the work among more people and people work less hours. So we produce less and we work less, which if what we don't produce anymore was damaging or useless, is fine. If we were producing hospitals and now we work less and we don't have doctors anymore in the hospitals, that's a problem. But if we were producing bubble gum and then we stopped producing bubble gum, I mean, it's fine, you know, and the people who are producing bubblegum, they work less, they live nice lives. We pay them for not producing bubblegums and we don't have bubblegums. It's not a big deal, you know. So, so both cases. One is repurposing the economy so that people work in areas where we need work, in social care we need, in healthcare we need, in energy transition, there is work that needs to be done and that it's not done right now. So repurposing and revaluing the work of people there and working less to the extent that this is possible.
There's a question here.
Thank you. Hello. I'd like to ask a question or maybe to note on the thing. I see a lot of contradictions in the things you said because, for example, a while ago you said that you don't want any totality state and you cannot say to companies don't produce, I don't know, a set of clothes 2 times a year or something like that. But then you said you have to apply some regulations on it. So, you know, you whether don't use regulations or you use it, but then you become authority. And it's the same thing like with the bubblegums now. If you tells we don't lose anything, if we ban bubblegums, then you are an authority who says this. But what about people who like bubblegums? Thank you.
Yeah, you are an authority, exactly. I mean, you can't, there is no society that is organized without a state that has an authority. There is one thing to have an authority and regulation, and another is to be authoritarian. These two things should not be mixed. I mean, we had a state that said, no, it's not okay to smoke, you know. And it didn't ban smoke, but it made it so expensive that people stopped smoking. And if you want in the US, that it's the libertarian state of the world, you know, you can't smoke even I mean, you can't smoke anywhere. So they basically banned smoke, but they didn't call it banning. They tell you can't smoke like 3 meters from the building, but then you're in the middle of the highway, you know, so you go smoke there and they kill you. So it's not, you don't have the choice to smoke anymore in the United States. And that's good, you know, because they realized that smoking was having a huge cost in their society, was killing people, and was also having huge impact on the public finances. So there was a decision in that state that probably it's not considered an authoritarian state, but there was a decision by an authority, which is the state, to regulate smoking. That's how functional even capitalist societies work. You know, they regulate things. They regulated that you cannot work more than 40 or 45 or 46 hours. They regulated that children cannot work. All these things were at the beginning. You could put children to work in the factory. They had small hands and they were making things faster. Or you could have people to work like 60 hours per day in stupid jobs that it didn't matter if they were tired. So, okay, get them to work 60 hours. There was an authority that regulated. This shouldn't be confused for an authoritarian state. You are not authoritarian if you impose certain limits that they are for the greater good. Now, are bubble gums for the greater good? You're right. You are right. We can debate whether banning bubble gums, I mean, it was an extreme example, no? You might overreach there, you know, so it's always important to keep that in mind. But I don't think we should be afraid of regulation. I mean, regulation is right now. If you see how many regulations your country has, or how many regulations the European Union has, is an immense amount. They're just regulating other stuff, the wrong stuff. They're regulating that, for example, if you want to privatize, I don't know, the utility, etc., you can't do it. Or if you want to turn a private utility into public, you can't do it. I mean, there are limits. There are limits what you can do with the European competition market. All sorts of limits all the time. Capitalism also doesn't work without limits and rules and regulations. The question is what regulations? So you're right, yes, you might overreach. But my argument is that if we are serious about climate change, if we're serious about overusing resource use and screwing the planet, then limiting how much fast fashion is produced is reasonable. Limiting whether we want to produce bubble gums or work less, etc., is also a reasonable debate. I'm not saying that you need to do it, but it's a reasonable debate, as reasonable was to ban smoking. I mean, climate change is going to kill many more people than smoking. So if there was a case for banning smoking, there is an even stronger reason for banning fossil fuels and the industries that produce fossil fuels, and to an extent then activities that depend on fossil fuels.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time. Maybe one last question, okay.
Hello, maybe simple question. Does no growth means stagnation or even stunting?
Yes, but not stagnation within a growth economy, you know. So the term we use there is post-growth, you know, to signify the need. Because in the current economy, if you have stagnation, it is a problem, and it's a serious problem, because you have inequalities increasing, you have people losing their job and then not having opportunities to work, etc. So the question is that yes to stagnation, if you want, not to stagnation, but yes to a steady state of resource use, of output of the economy, etc. But in order for this to be socially sustainable and not to be like an undesirable situation as it is now, you need transformations, social transformations, policy transformations, institutional transformations. And to that extent, we can even learn from economies, capitalist economies, without big changes, but that have managed better stagnation than others. For example, there was an interesting paper that I saw just came out last week about the case of Japan, which is an economy that hasn't seen growth the last 30 years, you know, and demonstrates how through certain social changes, etc., the well-being of the population there has actually improved rather than disproved, you know. It has required the states to take care of public expenditures, spend more for public goods, etc. But I think it's interesting because you see already within progressive, socially progressive, I mean, politically Japan is conservative, so it doesn't mean that it has to be progressive in the sense of particular political party. But there are certain structures, historical structures in Japanese society that have led, in a way, have made it possible to manage, socially manage this stagnation in a way that hasn't fully deteriorated the life of people, and instead have led to social improvement. So that would be the idea, not just a stagnation the way we understand zero GDP today.
Thank you, Giorgos, for being here with us today. I was asked to, at the end, summarize the three main ideas of your contribution here today. I would say that they can be summed up as this, like degrowth or some form of post-growth transition to a steady state non-growing economy is necessary globally from a biophysical sense, because otherwise the growth economy will lead us to an ecological and societal collapse and mass die-off of human populations and other species. But it's not only necessary, in many ways we can say it is desirable, because it would lead to an economy which needs to produce less and thus also to work less, and a one which would be liberating also in many ways and would lead to a greater quality of life, even with less material consumption. And the third connected point, I would say, is that, and I think this was clear in the last parts of the debate, is that we shouldn't see limitation and limits only as something negative, as a constraint, but actually in the real world, knowing the limits and being able to consciously work with them, in one word, self-limitation, whether it is on the personal level or on the societal level in terms of democratic decision-making, is not a constraint or on freedom necessarily, but actually it's a condition of true freedom. Thank you, Giorgos.
Thank you very much.